January 28, 1986. 73 seconds after liftoff, Space Shuttle Challenger came apart in the sky over Florida. 7 people were on board. Investigators spent months finding out why. The real answer started 6 hours earlier. It started 6 hours earlier. 30 miles outside Brigham City, Utah, an engineer named Bob Ebeling is driving to work with his daughter. He pounds his fist on the dashboard. "The Challenger's going to blow up," he says. "Everyone's going to die." He isn't guessing. He works for Morton Thiokol, the company that builds part of the machine now sitting on a launch pad 600 miles away, hours from launch. 7 people are on that machine. One of them is a schoolteacher, chosen out of 11,000 applicants to be the first ordinary citizen in space. Bob Ebeling had spent the night before trying to stop this launch. This is the story of the warning nobody above him ever heard. This is the story of Space Shuttle Challenger. The warning an engineer gave the night before launch, the 8-degree reading nobody above him ever saw, and the 73 seconds that followed. Challenger was not new to this. By January 1986, it had already flown to space 9 times. It carried the first American woman into space, the first American spacewalk by a woman, the first African-American astronaut. In its first 3 years, it flew more missions than any other orbiter in the fleet. This flight, designated STS-51L, had 3 jobs: deploy a communications satellite, release a small science satellite to study Halley's Comet, and carry a passenger no shuttle had ever carried before. Not an astronaut, a teacher. In August 1984, President Reagan announced a new program, the Teacher in Space Project. The first ordinary citizen would fly on the space shuttle, and NASA would pick a school teacher to do it. 11,000 teachers applied. The field narrowed to 114. Then, in July 1985, at a ceremony at the White House, NASA named its winner, Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from Concord High School in New Hampshire. She had written in her application that she wanted to demystify NASA and spaceflight, to keep a journal in orbit that would, in her words, humanize the experience. She trained for months. 0 gravity flights, simulators, meetings with the 6 professional astronauts she'd be flying alongside. Back home, her students at Concord High School planned to watch the launch live, in the school auditorium, on television. 6 professional astronauts would fly with her. Commander Dick Scobie, a Vietnam combat pilot, flying his 2nd mission into space, his 1st in command. Pilot Michael Smith, a Navy test pilot who had flown fighter jets off aircraft carriers. This was his first space flight. Mission Specialist Ellison Onizuka, an aerospace engineer from Hawaii, the first Asian American to fly in space, on his 2nd mission. Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer with a Ph.D., one of the first American women to fly in space. Mission Specialist Ronald McNair, a physicist, a 5th-degree black belt, on his 2nd flight. He had once played saxophone in orbit. And Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, an engineer flying an experiment for his employer, bumped from 3 earlier flights before finally getting his seat on this one. 7 people, and a machine with a part in it that had been quietly failing for 9 years. The solid rocket boosters that lift the shuttle off the pad are built in segments, sealed together with rubber O-rings roughly the thickness of a rope. In 1977, 6 years before Challenger ever flew, engineers testing those joints found something wrong. Under the pressure of ignition, the joint itself would bend, and the seal could open a gap. They called it joint rotation. It meant the O-ring wasn't just sealing a joint, it was fighting one. 4 years later, on only the 2nd shuttle flight, engineers found the first real evidence. An O-ring recovered after flight showed erosion. Something hot had been getting past the seal. Then, in January 1985, 1 year, almost to the day, before Challenger, a shuttle launched in the coldest weather yet. When investigators examined its boosters afterward, they found the worst O-ring damage anyone had ever seen. Cold weather and O-ring failure were no longer a theory. They were a pattern, sitting in a file, a full year before anyone died. On July 31, 1985, Thiokol engineer Roger Boisegali put it in writing. If the joint problem wasn't fixed, he wrote, the result would be, quote, a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. 6 months later, on the coldest morning a shuttle had ever launched in, that memo would still be sitting in a file. On the evening of January 27th, a forecast came in. Launch morning would be the coldest a shuttle had ever flown in. Someone had to decide if that mattered. A teleconference opened, connecting 3 places at once: Thiokol's engineers in Utah, NASA managers in Alabama, and NASA's team at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Engineer Roger Boisgoli presented the data. Every time a shuttle had launched cold, its O-rings showed damage. The colder the launch, the worse the damage. Thiokol's formal recommendation was blunt: do not launch below 53 degrees. 53 degrees was the coldest they had ever flown in and survived. The forecast for the morning was 8. NASA pushed back. One manager said he was appalled by the recommendation. Another engineer would later recall a NASA official asking, in frustration, when exactly Thiokol wanted him to launch. Next April? Thiokol asked for a private caucus to talk it over, off the line. It was supposed to take 5 minutes. It took 30. Inside that room, a senior vice president turned to Thiokol's engineering chief and told him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. When the line reopened, the recommendation had reversed. Thiokol's own management now said it was safe to fly. The engineers who had argued against it were not asked to vote. Roger Boisgoli signed nothing. He later testified, "I left the room feeling badly defeated. This was a meeting where the determination was to launch, and it was up to us to prove it was not safe to do so." One more Thiokol engineer at Kennedy Space Center refused to put his name on the launch approval. He told a NASA manager, "If anything happens to this launch, I don't want to be the one explaining why we flew." At 11:45 that night, someone else signed in his place. The recommendation to launch was telefaxed to Kennedy. The warning never went further than that room. It never reached the one NASA official whose job it was to give the final go. The next morning, ice crews walked the launch pad with broom handles, knocking icicles a foot long off the gantry. The overnight low had been the coldest Kennedy Space Center had recorded in years. The launch, already delayed for days, slipped another 2 hours while engineers argued over whether the ice itself was dangerous. An infrared scanner was pointed at the joint that mattered most, the same right-side booster joint the engineers had warned about the night before. It read 8 degrees. 45 degrees colder than the coldest launch the O-rings had ever survived. Nobody scrubbed the mission. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Challenger lifted off pad 39B. Less than 1 second after ignition, cameras caught something small. A puff of black smoke, right at the joint the engineers had warned about. The cold O-ring hadn't sealed properly. For a moment, burned grease and debris plugged the gap by accident. As the shuttle climbed, wind shear flexed the booster. The seal that had been accidentally plugged came open again. At 58 seconds, a small flame appeared at the joint, invisible to the crew, barely visible on camera. At 65 seconds, the flame changed. It had burned through the wall of the external fuel tank and was now feeding on leaking hydrogen. At 68 seconds, Mission Control gave the standard call, "Challenger, go with throttle up." Commander Dick Scobie answered, "Roger, go at throttle up. It was the crew's last complete transmission." 4 seconds later, pilot Michael Smith can be heard saying 2 words, "Uh-oh." At 73 seconds, the flame burned through the strut, holding the booster to the fuel tank. The tank ruptured, its contents ignited. The orbiter itself was never destroyed by an explosion. It was torn apart by the force of the air around it, moving at nearly twice the speed of sound. 7 people were on board. 6 days later, President Reagan formed a commission to find out what happened. He gave it 120 days. Its chairman was a former Secretary of State. Its vice chairman was Neil Armstrong. One of its members was a physicist named Richard Feynman. On live television, on February 11th, Feynman produced a small piece of O-ring material, clamped it, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. When he pulled it out and released the clamp, the rubber did not spring back into shape. It stayed flat, exactly as it had been forced. That was the whole failure, demonstrated in 30 seconds, in a glass of ice water, in front of the country. The Commission's technical finding matched what Boisgoli had warned about 6 months earlier, almost exactly: a cold, brittle O-ring in a joint that had never been designed to hold in the cold. But the Commission went further. The real failure, it found, wasn't a part. It was a decision-making process it called clearly flawed, one where engineering warnings from the working level never reached the people making the final call. A sociologist who studied the case afterward gave that pattern a name: normalization of deviance. Each time a shuttle flew with damage and landed safely anyway, the danger looked a little more normal, until the day it wasn't. For years afterward, one question about that day refused to go away. Did the crew survive the breakup itself? NASA investigated this specifically, and the answer it gave is more careful than most people expect. The crew compartment did not explode. It separated from the disintegrating orbiter largely intact and kept climbing for another 25 seconds before it began to fall. It fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before it struck the ocean. Investigators later found that 3 of the 4 emergency air packs on board had been switched on by hand, evidence that at least some of the crew were alive and functioning after the breakup. NASA's own medical investigation concluded the forces of the breakup itself were, in its words, probably not sufficient to cause death or serious injury. Whether the crew stayed conscious for the fall is something the physical evidence could never fully answer. What NASA's investigators did state plainly: death is attributed to the impact with the ocean, not the breakup that came 2 minutes and 45 seconds before it. No one was ever criminally charged over the Challenger disaster. Not at NASA, not at Thiokol. The families were compensated through civil settlements instead. The government and Thiokol jointly paid the families of 4 of the crew members. 3 more families settled separately, directly with Thiokol. The government did not contribute to those payments at all. Pilot Michael Smith's widow sued both the government and Thiokol. A federal court dismissed her claim against the government outright. A legal doctrine bars lawsuits over a service member's death while on duty. Because Smith was Navy, that doctrine applied. The government that sent her husband to space never paid his family $1 directly. Her claim against Thiokol, as a private company, was allowed to proceed. Roger Boisgoli, the engineer who wrote the warning memo 6 months before the disaster, never worked on another rocket. He spent the rest of his career teaching engineering ethics at more than 300 universities and companies. In 1988, the American Association for the Advancement of Science gave him an award for scientific freedom and responsibility, for the warning almost no one had listened to. Bob Ebeling, the man who pounded the dashboard that morning, carried the guilt for 30 years, believing he could have stopped the launch himself. On the 30th anniversary, in 2016, he agreed to tell a reporter his story publicly for the first time. Listeners wrote him hundreds of letters. He died 2 months later. The one Thiokol engineer at Kennedy who refused to sign the launch approval, Alan McDonald, later testified to the commission about the reversal that night, testimony that forced Thiokol and NASA to admit what had actually happened in that room. All 3 men are gone now. None of them were ever blamed for what happened. Every one of them was right. The 7 families didn't just grieve, they built something. Within a year of the disaster, they founded the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, a nonprofit designed to put kids through simulated space missions instead of letting the disaster be the last thing anyone remembered about it. Today it runs 34 Challenger Learning Centers around the world. One of the newest opened in 2026, the first ever built from the ground up instead of retrofitted into an existing building. More than 800 people came to its opening. Commander Dick Scobie's widow, June Scobie Rogers, helped found the organization nearly 40 years ago. She still visits the centers in person today. Every January, NASA holds a day of remembrance. In 2026, family members came back to Kennedy Space Center for the 40th time. Pilot Michael Smith's widow, Jane Smith Woolcott, stood at the memorial and spoke. "Every day I miss Mike," she said. "Every day's the same." His daughter Allison was 14 years old when he died. She spoke too, through tears. "We are all part of this story," she said. 40 years later, they were still standing at the same launch complex, still saying his name out loud. The shuttle program was grounded for 32 months, the longest pause in its history. Engineers redesigned the joint completely, a third O-ring, a metal feature to physically lock the segments together, so the failure that killed 7 people could not happen the same way twice. NASA created a new safety office that reported directly to the head of the agency, closing the exact gap that had kept a night before warning from ever reaching the person who needed to hear it. Decades later, when a different NASA spacecraft ran into trouble, astronauts stranded, an unproven vehicle, the agency chose the slower, safer option instead of pushing the schedule. People who study the decision point directly back to 1986. The warning that could have stopped Challenger existed in writing 6 months before the launch. It existed again, out loud, the night before. It never had to be a mystery. It just never reached the one person who could have said no. That's the part of this story that never gets old and never gets easier to hear. If a warning nobody heard is what got you about this one, wait until you see what nobody heard on Swissair Flight 111, a wiring fire in 17 minutes on this channel. Subscribe to Black Box Breakdown for the next real investigation.
If this one got under your skin a little, good. That's the point. And it only keeps happening because people like you keep showing up.
So do one thing for me. Hit subscribe. It is free, and it is the whole reason Black Box can keep taking these disasters apart.